Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing at the edge of ancient Rome. Not the Rome of marble statues and triumphal processions, but the real Rome, the one that smelled. It's just before dawn. The city is already moving. Wooden cartwheels grind against stone paving. Merchants shout. A dog barks from somewhere high above you. You look up and see a 6-story apartment building looming overhead, its laundry hanging from windows, its walls cracked and stained. From somewhere up there, something wet hits the street near your feet. You don't want to know what it was. This is Rome at the height of the empire, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people packed into an area smaller than modern Manhattan, the largest city in the Western world, and one of the loudest, most chaotic, most dangerous places a human being could live. Here's something most people don't know. Rome actually banned wheeled vehicles from its streets during the day. The streets were so congested, so narrow, so permanently gridlocked that Julius Caesar himself issued an edict: no carts, no wagons during daylight hours. So every merchant, every builder, every supplier who needed to move goods did it at night. The result? The city never actually went to sleep. Roman writers like Juvenal complained bitterly about the noise, the grinding of wheels, the shouting of drivers, the clanging of metalworkers who started before dawn. Sleep in Rome, he wrote, was something only the rich could afford. The wealthy lived on quiet streets in private houses. Everyone else lay awake listening to the city roar. And that gap between the wealthy and everyone else is the story of Rome. Not the story of emperors and generals, but the story of the other 90%. The people who made it all work. Let's follow one of them through a single day. He's not a senator, he's not a soldier, he's a freedman, a former slave who bought his freedom working as a skilled potter. He lives on the 4th floor of an insula in the Subura district, Rome's most notorious neighborhood, crowded, loud, dangerous and cheap. His apartment is one room, no kitchen, no toilet, no running water. The window has no glass, just wooden shutters that let in both light and rain, and in summer clouds of mosquitoes. The poorest families lived on the upper floors of these insulae, harder to reach and far more dangerous if a fire started. Marcus is not the poorest. The truly destitute lived on the 6th and 7th floors, where the rent was cheapest and the fire risk was greatest. Rome had no fire department, not a real one. When an insula caught fire, it burned, and they caught fire constantly because everyone cooked with open flames or braziers, and the buildings were largely wood. The Emperor Augustus eventually created the Vigiles, 7,000 freed slaves whose job was to watch for fires and fight them. But fighting a 6-story burning building with buckets of water and vinegar was about as effective as you'd expect. Marcus wakes at dawn. Not because of an alarm, Romans had no clocks. They tracked time by the position of the sun, dividing day and night into 12 equal hours, which meant that an hour in summer was longer than an hour in winter. Dawn was the first hour. Work began at the first hour, not because anyone told you to, but because daylight was precious and in Rome, time was money. He washes his face in a clay basin, water he carried up 4 flights of stairs the previous evening from the street-level fountain. Rich Romans could have water piped directly to their homes. Those pipes were taxed, and the larger the pipe, the more tax they paid. For Marcus, water means walking. Fathom entertainment breakfast is fast and simple. A chunk of bread, probably yesterday's, dipped in olive oil or vinegar to soften it. Maybe some olives, maybe a fig. Romans didn't really believe in morning meals. The irontaculum, as they called breakfast, was barely worth mentioning. What mattered was what came later. He pulls on his tunic, a simple woolen garment that falls to the knee. The toga, that famous draped cloth we associate with Rome, was actually uncomfortable, impractical, and largely ceremonial. Regular people wore tunics. The toga was for formal occasions, public appearances, and the wealthy showing off. Marcus has a toga. He wore it once to a court hearing. He hated it. Marcus steps outside and immediately becomes part of the noise. The Suburra is Rome's most densely populated district. Writers called it the worst neighbourhood in the city, full of taverns, brothels, street vendors, pickpockets, and the permanently unemployed. It was also full of ordinary working people just trying to get through the day. Rome had no real concept of zoning. A bakery could be next to a perfume shop, next to a tannery, next to a senator's house. The city was chaos layered on top of chaos. His first stop is the Thermopolium on the corner. Since there was no refrigeration, shopping was done daily at the many small shops and street carts or in the city's forum. The Thermopolium, Rome's version of a fast food counter, has stone countertops with large terracotta containers sunk into them, kept warm by coals underneath. Lentil stew, salted fish, spiced wine. Marcus eats standing up, elbow to elbow with a grain merchant, a Greek-speaking teacher and someone whose profession he'd rather not ask about. He pays with a small bronze coin, an ass, worth roughly the price of a loaf of bread. The streets of Rome were layered with sound, street hawkers advertising their goods, the clink of coins in money changers' stalls, the rhythmic hammering from metalworkers' shops, lawyers arguing outside basilicas, poets reciting for coins. People often dropped their trash directly out of windows, sometimes injuring people walking below. There were laws against this. Nobody cared. Beggars lined the approaches to temples. Former soldiers missing limbs sat outside taverns. Children ran barefoot between the legs of adults. Beggars and the homeless were a visible part of the Roman cityscape, shaped by high rents, precarious employment, and limited state relief. And yet, this city also had the most advanced infrastructure in the world. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system, was built in the 6th century BCE, and parts of it are still functioning today. Rome had 11 aqueducts delivering over 1 billion litres of fresh water to the city every single day. That's more water per person than many modern cities deliver. The engineering was extraordinary. The distribution was not. Most of it went to the wealthy and to public fountains, while the poor carried buckets. Marcus's pottery workshop is a short walk away, a small space on the ground floor of another insula, which doubles as both his workplace and his storefront. This arrangement was universal in Rome. The Romans built new towns wherever they went, and they always included bakeries, food stores, bars, and public bathhouses. Commerce was literally built into the architecture. He works from the first hour to about the 6th, roughly sunrise to noon. Most Roman men worked 6 hours or fewer each day, usually stopping around midday. This wasn't laziness, it was physics. The afternoon heat in Rome was brutal, and without air conditioning, working through it was both miserable and medically dangerous. The Roman workday was structured entirely around the sun. What work was available in Rome? More than you might think. Farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, entertainers, musicians, actors, chariot racers, gladiators, as well as lawyers, teachers, engineers, and government workers at every level from tax collectors to senators. Rome's economy was massive and complex. But here's the uncomfortable truth about Roman work. Slaves performed almost all of the menial jobs as well as many of the professions: teachers, doctors, surgeons, architects. Most freedmen worked at trades: bakers, fishmongers, carpenters. The Romans had essentially created a labour market where free workers competed against people who were paid nothing. The result was that wages for unskilled work were low, unemployment was high, and the gap between rich and poor was enormous. The number of slaves eventually became so numerous that it destabilized Roman society. The lower class of Roman citizens found it increasingly difficult to find low-skilled paid work, as they were replaced by slave labor. For those who couldn't find work, and there were many, Rome had an answer: the grain dole. Rome was the first society in history to offer a free grain allowance to its citizens, not just the poor, but any Roman citizen who qualified. Records indicate that as many as 200,000 people benefited from this at its peak. Feeding a city of 1 million people was Rome's greatest logistical challenge. Entire provinces, Sicily, Sardinia, Egypt, existed primarily to grow grain for the city. Marcus is not on the grain dole. He earns enough, but he knows men in his building who are. Men who wake up, collect their grain, and spend the rest of the day at the baths or watching races at the Circus Maximus. Bread and circuses. The Roman satirist Juvenal coined the phrase, mocking a population he believed had traded political engagement for free food and entertainment. Whether he was right is a debate historians still have. At midday, Marcus locks his shop and heads toward the Forum. The Forum Romanum was the centre of everything, not just commerce, though it was that. It was where courts operated, where politicians gave speeches, where religious ceremonies were performed, where news spread. In a world with no newspapers, no internet, no broadcast media, the Forum was where you found out what was happening. Lawyers argued cases in the basilicas flanking the Forum, and these trials were public entertainment. People gathered to watch skilled orators tear each other apart. Cicero, the greatest orator Rome produced, drew crowds the way modern celebrities draw fans. Oratory was an art to be practiced and learned. Becoming an effective orator was one of the primary objectives of Roman education, and good orators commanded tremendous respect. Political graffiti covered the walls of buildings around the Forum. Candidates for office paid people to write endorsements on walls. Their opponents paid people to write insults. Archaeologists have found campaign slogans painted on walls in Pompeii that read like modern political attack ads. Vote for Gaius, he's not like those other crooks. More or less, and everywhere in the Forum, temples. Romans were extraordinarily religious, but their religion looked nothing like modern faith. In the imperial era, as many as 135 days of the year were devoted to religious festivals and games. The Roman gods weren't primarily concerned with how you behaved morally. They were transactional. You gave them sacrifices and offerings, they gave you good fortune. You neglected them. Disaster followed. A Roman priest's duties included looking after temples, making sacrifices of bulls, sheep, and pigs to the gods, burning incense, and saying prayers. Special priests called augurs looked into the future using signs in nature, the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, to predict events. Before any major decision, military, political, personal, a Roman consulted the augurs. The idea that bird movements could predict the outcome of a battle sounds absurd to us. To a Roman, skipping this step before going to war was the absurd choice. After the Forum, there is only one place Marcus is going, the baths. If there's one institution that defines Roman daily life more than any other, more than the Colosseum, more than the Forum, it's the public baths. The thermae, and they were nothing like what you're picturing. Visiting the Roman thermae wasn't just a simple dip in the water. A visitor would begin by doing some light exercise, followed by a hot bath, then a warm bath, then a cold plunge. They could also spend time in a steam room, get a massage, or have their bodies scraped clean with a curved iron tool called a strigil, since soap as we know it didn't exist. But the physical bathing was almost secondary. The baths were Rome's social network. They were where you met clients, made deals, gossiped about politics, listened to philosophers lecture, watched musicians perform. They had libraries, they had snack vendors walking the halls selling sausages and pastries. They had barbers and masseuses and people who specialised in removing body hair. Public baths were considered a symbol of Roman identity. They were built in nearly every part of the empire, as far north as the British Isles and as far south as Egypt. In 33 BCE, there were 170 bathhouses in Rome. By 400 CE, there were over 800, including the massive baths of Trajan, Caracalla, and Diocletian. Entry was almost free. Sometimes it was free, paid for by emperors or wealthy patrons wanting to curry public favour. Women, slaves and children all participated. though at different hours, since mixed bathing was sometimes controversial and different emperors had different rules about it. The baths were Rome's great equalizer. In the water, a successful merchant and a newly freed slave looked the same. The senator who wouldn't acknowledge you in the forum might chat with you about the chariot races in the Caldarium. Social hierarchies relaxed, not disappeared but softened. Romans understood something we sometimes forget, that shared physical spaces create community in ways that nothing else can. Marcus spends 2 hours at the baths. He's scraped clean, muscles loose, and has negotiated a small contract with a wine merchant he met in the steam room. Not bad for an afternoon. On certain days, and there were many, the afternoon wasn't for the baths, it was for the spectacles. The Circus Maximus was built to hold an audience of between 250,000 and 275,000 spectators. Let that number settle for a moment. The entire population of many modern cities packed into one arena, screaming for their favourite chariot team. The blues, the greens, the reds, the whites. Chariot racing in Rome had the intensity of modern football rivalries. Fans wore their team's colours, bet enormous sums on outcomes, and occasionally rioted when their team lost. The charioteers themselves were mostly slaves or freedmen, but the successful ones became the closest thing Rome had to modern celebrities. The charioteer Gaius Appuleius Diocles, who raced in the 2nd century CE, won 1,462 races over his career and accumulated prize money equivalent, in modern terms, to several $billion. He retired wealthy. Most charioteers weren't so lucky. Crashes at high speed in a tight oval with 12 chariots competing simultaneously killed drivers regularly. Then there was the Colosseum, opened in 80 CE, capable of holding up to 80,000 spectators. It had a retractable awning to shade the crowd. It had numbered seats and designated sections for different social classes. It could be flooded for naval battle reenactments. It had an underground system of tunnels and elevators, operated by slaves turning massive capstans that could lift animals and gladiators directly into the arena floor through trapdoors. Gladiatorial combat is what we remember, but the Colosseum hosted a full day of events. Morning, animal hunts, exotic beasts from across the empire, lions from Africa, bears from Germany, crocodiles from Egypt, fighting each other or fighting specialized hunters called bestiarii. Midday, executions of criminals and enemies of the state, sometimes elaborate reenactments of mythological scenes. Afternoon, the gladiators. These events had fighters who were often slaves or prisoners, who battled each other to entertain the crowd. On special days, even the emperor came to watch. Between spectacles, Romans gambled, constantly. A love of gambling extended to all levels of ancient Roman society. Dice games were technically illegal in most settings, except during the festival of Saturnalia. This law was universally ignored. Tavern floors were covered in dice marks. Public baths had gambling in the changing rooms. Even the soldiers on Hadrian's walls scratched game boards into the stone. By late afternoon, the 9th or 10th hour, Rome's attention turned to the most important event of the day, dinner. For the wealthy, dinner was theatre. It was not unusual for wealthy households in ancient Rome to have huge feasts at dinner time. More than just a meal, those feasts were events. Dinner included several courses and entertainment and could last for hours. Guests could eat so much they made themselves sick. The triclinium, the dining room, was typically arranged with 3 couches around a central table, with guests reclining rather than sitting upright. You ate lying down, propped on your left elbow. Slaves brought course after course, eggs and olives to start, then fish and shellfish, then roasted meats, then sweets and fruit. Wine flowed constantly, always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric. The food Romans ate would surprise you. Many foods we consider Italian today didn't exist in early Rome. No potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, no peppers, no rice, no sugar. No oranges, grapefruits, apricots or peaches. Instead, wheat, barley, lentils, fava beans, olives, grapes, figs, pears, apples. Meat was expensive and eaten sparingly by most. Pork was the most common. Fish, particularly salted fish, was everywhere. The Romans' greatest flavour enhancer was garum, a fermented fish sauce made by packing fish in salt and letting them liquefy over months in the sun. The result smelled indescribable. The taste, umami-rich, salty complex, was used in virtually every dish the way we use salt today. Rome's most prized garum came from Spain, and it was shipped across the empire in distinctive ceramic amphorae. For the poor, for most Romans, dinner looked nothing like this. Many of the extremely poor or homeless ate rancid cereal or gruel, and the lack of a quality diet caused many to suffer from malnutrition. The standard poor Roman diet was bread, olives, cheap wine, and whatever came in the grain dole. Meat was a luxury for festival days. The taste of fresh meat was something many Romans experienced only a few times a year. One Roman celebrity chef, Marcus Gavius Apicius, wrote a recipe book that has survived to today, including a recipe for minced meat mixed with bread soaked in white wine, stone-ground pine kernels, green peppercorns, and salt, formed into balls and cooked over fire. A Roman meatball 2,000 years old that you could make tonight. At the centre of Roman life, more important than the forum, more important than the baths, was the family. The head of the household was the father, known as the paterfamilias, who had full authority. He managed all family matters, including how money was spent and all marriage decisions. Everyone in his household, even adult sons, were under the paterfamilias' control until he died. This sounds extreme, and it was. In theory, a paterfamilias had the legal power of life and death over his household. In practice, social norms constrained this. Roman society disapproved of a father punishing his family without good cause. But the power was real. A father could reject a newborn child, leaving the infant exposed to die or be taken by someone else. He could sell his children into slavery. He decided who they married. Roman women occupy a complicated position in history. On paper, they had few legal rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold political office, needed a male guardian for major legal transactions. In practice, wealthy matrons from powerful families had considerable freedom. They could own property and run their own businesses. They could hire slaves to do housework, freeing them to study art and literature. Under the empire, women could run a business, could get a job, and wealthy merchants could buy farmland and build villas. Roman women ran bakeries, dye shops, textile businesses. Some became extremely wealthy in their own right. The evidence is in their wills, their tombstones, their portraits. Children in wealthy families started school around age 6 or 7. Education began with basics of reading, writing, and counting. By age 12, they were learning Latin, Greek, grammar, and literature, followed by training in public speaking, since oratory was the most valued skill in Roman public life. Poor children learned from their parents. A baker's son learned to bake. A fisherman's daughter learned to net. If your father worked in politics, you were expected to become a politician. If he was a slave, you would also be a slave. Social mobility existed. The story of Marcus the freedman potter is evidence, but it was the exception, not the rule. As the sun sets over Rome, the city changes character. The wealthy don't walk at night, they ride in litters, enclosed chairs carried by slaves, or have servants with torches walking ahead to light the way. To go long distances, wealthy people often use carriages or litters carried by slaves. For everyone else, night in Rome was genuinely dangerous. There was no street lighting beyond private torches, no police. The vigiles were fire watchers and only intermittently acted as security. Muggers, pickpockets, and gangs operated freely in the darker alleys. Inside homes, evening brought religion. Every home had a household shrine where families honoured the lares, household guardian spirits. Families would make offerings of food and wine, asking for protection through the night. Many Romans treated omens, portents, dreams, curses, celestial events, and even the restless dead as meaningful signs, and these assumptions could influence everything from household routines to public decision-making. Fear of malevolent spirits and haunted places formed part of the same wider mental world of ritual, superstition, and divine communication. Romans were afraid of the dark in ways that went beyond simple physical danger. The world after sunset belonged to spirits, to ghosts, to forces that daylight kept at bay. Before sleeping, you prayed. You made your offering at the lararium. You asked the household gods for one more night of safety, and then the carts came out again. The city ground back into motion, and somewhere in his fourth-floor room, Marcus lay in the dark, listening to Rome roar below him and tried to sleep. 2,000 years separate us from Marcus. 2,000 years of history, plague, empire, religion, revolution, technology. And yet, he worried about rent. He ate cheap street food. He gossiped at the equivalent of a coffee shop. He watched sports and argued about the results. He tried to advance in a system that wasn't designed for him. He came home tired and prayed that tomorrow would be a little better. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years. It fell, slowly, then all at once, under the weight of its own contradictions. Economic inequality, political corruption, military overextension, disease. Some historians point to the poor of the city, the squalor, the rise of the unemployed, the increase in disease and crime, as contributing factors to the Western Empire's eventual demise. But what it built, its roads, its legal system, its architecture, its language, shaped every civilization that came after it. You're speaking a language built on Latin right now. You live under a legal system descended from Roman law. The very word civilization comes from the Latin civitas, city, the city that Marcus woke up in every morning. If you want more stories like this, the real history, the people history forgot, subscribe. I put out a new documentary every week. Different time, different place, same question. What was it actually like to be there? Drop a comment. Tell me what surprised you most about daily life in Rome. I read every single one. See you in the next one.